Welcome to Sproutcast, where we speak with changemakers, social innovators, and entrepreneurs about how to make the world a better place. And now, here's your host, Julia Duffy.
Welcome back to Sproutcast. My name is Julia Duffy, and today we're speaking with Dr. Jason Fox, best-selling author, international speaker, advisor, and motivation design specialist. Thanks very much for joining us today, Jason.
No worries.
So I start every interview by asking my guests about their experiences of and their history with the nonprofit sector. So what was your first engagement with the sector, and what kind of influence do you think that's had on the way you view nonprofit organisations?
Sure, cool. So my first experience with the not-for-profit sector was really when I was doing environmental science. It was my undergraduate at university. Environmental science then led to environmental education. And I did a lot of work, actually coordinated units in environmental education and education for sustainability, and partnered up with not-for-profits around community education to help people engage in more sustainable behaviours. And that then led to a lot of frustration because at the time, environmental education was simply about awareness raising, turn off the lights and do your recycling and so on. It seemed really tokenistic, and the awareness didn't always translate into change behaviour. So I researched that, which then led to education for behaviour change, which then led to my research in motivation design. But a lot of this started really from the good work that was happening, or the good purpose-driven work in the not-for-profit sector. And more recently, I've been working with not-for-profits like Red Cross that are looking at how they engaged with volunteers, how they actually keep people motivated beyond payment-based forms of motivation. And so it's all been fascinating in the not-for-profit sector.
Excellent. I'm glad that you've been able to bring that back round to the motivation design aspect, and because I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what kind of impact or relationship that could have with organisations working in the non-profit sector. And you mentioned earlier purpose, which is definitely something we're hearing people talk about, that is kind of bringing out some potential in some undiscovered potential in organisations, and particularly in new organisations. Do you have any thoughts on how motivation design could help non-profit organisations?
There's this conventional model in business that most people have adopted around payment-based motivation or extrinsic motivators, such as if you do this, you'll get this, whether that's a bonus or some sort of pay, or you'll be elevated into a new position and so on. And that's worked really well for formulaic work. It's great if you're running a factory and you want people to be more productive, doing fairly predictable, repetitive work with predictable outcomes. It's really ineffective for the future of work, which is much more collaborative and creative, and it really just doesn't factor in the powerful intrinsic motivational effects of purpose-driven work. One of the challenges, though, is a lot of is keeping the purpose element of your work alive and keeping it real. It's very easy to have a shallow, tokenistic mission statement, vision, or purpose that sits there on the wall and doesn't actually contribute to people's motivation to do the work. It is also a bit of a threat for many not-for-profits that start with such a really, really clear, vivid, real purpose, and then as the years progress by, begin to lose their way and lose their connection to that initial purpose. And so when it comes to motivation design, one of the key things we need to do, particularly for purpose-driven leaders and anyone who wants to build a team that are rallying around purpose, is to think about it in the terms of what are your structures, rituals, and artifacts, or the triggers that will keep people connected to this purpose. Naturally, you still need to provide some sort of equitable, what I usually say for most organisations, because most of my work is in the for-profit area, you still need to pay people well. In the not-for-profit sector, there's still an element of that. You still need to make sure that people are compensated fairly for the effort that they're doing. But the idea is, let's get money out of the equation as early as we can. Just pay people well, and then don't resort to that as a motivator, because there's much more powerful things than money to keep people motivated, purpose being one of them. But if we're to use purpose, people need to be able to connect with it. We need to have rituals around it, so regular sacred routines that help us to connect the effort that we're doing with the purpose that we're contributing to. And this is something that we need to be able to do in a way that provides a visible sense of progress. Purpose is not something that can just be some ethereal concept that sits above us or sits on some plaque somewhere. It needs to be real, and it becomes real when we see how our efforts are contributing to meaningful progress. And the whole question around what does meaningful progress look like in the context of this purpose-driven work is one of the most important questions that any leader can ask themselves.
Excellent. So I think a few of the points that you just brought up would be particularly relevant to people who might be starting their own organization or enterprise. And I think this would be a stage when it may be difficult to motivate staff financially, particularly with a social enterprise when funding is low. But they do, I guess, have the advantage of the sense of purpose related with the work and the progress, I guess, related to it being a new organization. How would you maintain that over time, though, once the kind of initial burst of the organization establishing starts?
Yeah, and this happens in all industries. Whether you have a startup, there's all sorts of enthusiasm. People are putting in massive amounts of discretionary effort, late nights, working together to make this thing happen. And then the challenge starts, and if it's a social enterprise, startup, whatever it is, the challenge starts when things start to grow. Now, if things start starting to grow, this is a wonderful sign, because it means you're having an effect. You're doing something, you're actually meeting a market need, or you're actually delivering value. You have an organization that is generating value. So that's wonderful. But what can happen is the curse of efficiency can start to creep in. And this is something that most of the time efficiency is wonderful. It saves us from having to waste time or duplicate effort. But sometimes once you start to do something that seems to work, we can stop thinking, are there better ways here? And if you're running an organization that's purpose-driven, that you've gathered a bunch of people together and it's working, and it's been working for a while, sometimes we can fall into the trap of just keeping on doing what's working, which means we start to lose some curiosity of exploring better ways. And if this progresses and continues, we can then start to lose empathy. And what happens is you have an organization that starts off really good, it grows, people are really smart, efficient, they're really busy, and then it turns into this thing that no one really connects with or relates to, and no one really knows exactly where the shift happened. But you end up with this thing where no one's really connected to the purpose. It's all hard work. There's the team dynamics are falling apart, and all those things that really turn into a non-ideal workplace to work at. Even though you've got a great purpose that got you somewhere, no one's really connected to it anymore. And the way that we protect against that is by deliberately going against the grain of efficiency. By carving out time to have rituals. So carving out rituals to put the spotlight on meaningful progress, to ask the questions, is this meaningful progress? Are we actually contributing meaningful progress? Is this purpose still relevant, or have things evolved? Are there new emerging needs in the market or in the world that we're serving that we otherwise might be missing if we don't ask these questions? It's by doing those activities that we stay relevant. And that's really hard for anyone to do, because you're essentially going against something that's working really well for you. You're taking time away from really efficient, productive work in order to ask these very important questions that don't have immediate payoffs, but serve you really, really well in the mid to long term.
From the perspective of an emerging leader, I'm also interested to discuss with you some of the other kind of leadership skills that leaders should be aspiring to. And I guess I just wanted to discuss leadership with you in general, which is something that you're actually covering off in your new book, How to Lead a Quest. So I guess to kick off the discussion of that broader topic, I wanted to first ask you, what is a quest and why should leaders be going on one?
Yeah, cool. Great. Well, there are so let's there are two types of leadership. There are actually plenty of types, but broadly speaking, you could say there are two types. The one that we're very familiar with is operational leadership, which is where you have someone who leads, who has really, if it can't get measured, it can't get done, who has really clear goals, clear targets, measurable incremental growth and improvement. You can actually tick all the right boxes. You can see everything that's there. It's all working really well. It's very firm. It's very visible. It's very, very clear and rigid, this operational leadership. Then there's a more pioneering form of leadership, which is where you're actually deliberately stepping into uncertainty. Operational leadership works really well with clear numbers and parameters. Pioneering leaders are those that are able to step into the space of uncertainty, to progress through complexity and ambiguity in order to find new pathways, to find new value. We need both forms of leadership. But I think that the pioneering form of leadership is something that has suffered recently and has been drowned out, particularly in larger organizations. Most people, I imagine, listening to this podcast, if your organization is relatively new or still growing, you're still in a pioneering space. And we want to be able to preserve that no matter where we are. Quests help us with this. You see, the biggest threat to any organization, I believe, is default thinking. It's almost the non-thinking, the non-questioning of how we do things. It can be apathetic, even though you can be really efficient and getting great results. This default thinking, combined with the fact that the future is infinitely complex and uncertain and ambiguous, means that we can find ourselves falling in this trap of doing what's worked well for us in the past, but not asking the right questions, not exploring. And so if you look at the definition of default, the default is the option we choose automatically in the absence of viable alternatives. A quest is the search for an alternative that meets cognitive criteria. So unlike a mission or a goal or a target, with a quest, we don't know what the answer is. We're just working from a clear premise. Our intent is essentially to find alternative options. We keep doing the default work. We keep on going with what's working. But we also stay open to explore and to find alternative ways to generate new value that meets market needs. And that's what leading a quest is all about. What are the alternative viable options that are available to us, so that when it comes to strategic thinking, strategic leadership, and decision making, we're not just presented with the default options that work well for us. We also have the ability to explore alternative options. Now, of course, we explore alternative options through experimentation, which helps to ensure that these options are viable and valid. But what this ultimately means is we have a balance between efficient operational leadership and the capacity to pioneer and grow and explore new areas. And if you look at the companies that endure over time, over a long period of time, they're the companies that maintain a healthy level of pioneering leadership, which is something that if you've got it in your leadership team right now, we need to preserve it and rescue it from the threat of efficiency. And if you don't have it, or if things have gotten into the state where you're working in a not-for-profit that's been around for decades, and you've got policies and procedures, and everyone's got their clear work job descriptions and everything seems really rigid, what we need to start doing is to reintroduce curiosity and empathy into the mix. And that's what's going to help to pave the way for more pioneering leadership.
So what would a quest look like within an organization, just to provide some context of how you could maybe integrate that thinking into an existing organization? When would it happen? Who would be involved in the process?
Cool. It would happen constantly, but we'd see it most visibly through rituals. So this is where people say, okay, it's that time of the year, or it's that time every 6 months where we actually get together and we review our business model. Now, if your listeners, you'd want to check out businessmodelgeneration.com. It's a wonderful book published, Business Model Generation, possibly the best business book I've ever read. And it has a canvas on there, which you can download for free with Creative Commons Business Model Generation canvas. If you Google that, you'll find it. And this is a really useful tool that maps out all the moving parts of any organization, such as What's your value proposition? Who are your customer segments? What are the key customer relationships, the channels that you use to reach them, the partners that you work with, the resources that you use, the key activities that you have, your cost and revenue, and all of that is there for you. And it's very easy to go on for years potentially without actually reviewing what is your business model and how is this working. Now, this process of reviewing the business model once every 3 months, say, or once every 6 months, usually brings up some immediate tactical concerns, which are addressed through operational leadership. So people might realize that, wow, are we still using that partner? Or, wow, how is it that we're not actually serving this customer segment? Or, are we still advertising in the yellow pages? Is there a better channel that we can use here? All of these questions warrant immediate tactical responses, which is great. The real quest begins where we look at the business model and rather just make changes or decisions to serve the current context that we're in, we start to anticipate what are the emerging future contexts. Out of all the possible future contexts, of which they're infinite, let's imagine up different scenarios and then contrast our current business model against those emerging possible contexts. And by doing that, we might start to find some common incoherencies, these areas or elements of our business model that just wouldn't be viable in these different futures. So, for example, in the not-for-profit space, a lot of people work with volunteers, and volunteers may be a key resource that makes a business model work or makes an enterprise model work. But there may be possible changes coming up in the future that have an impact on how you do things. I'm making things up as we go here, but one of the things there may be, it might be that there's increasingly more online volunteering work for a particular company. It might be that there's new legal hoops that you need to jump through. It might be that a competitor comes out with short-term volunteering job type positions. There's a bunch of different scenarios that if your team can get together and imagine up these different futures, you'll be able to then contrast your business model against these to find out these incoherencies. So in other industries I work in, one of the things they're finding is they're anticipating that in the future, people are going to want more flexibility in their work. And so if you imagine a large corporate organization, a multinational that has very rigid office hours, there may be a future where they just can't really employ anyone because of how rigid they are. And people, generation-wise, are going to be looking for work that provides flexibility, as in do work they want when they want. And so a quest for that type of organization would be, okay, let's explore some alternative options here. We've got this current default model we use here, but what are the other options available? And therein begins the search for viable alternative options to the current model around how they recruit and how they run time with their workforce. And so there is how a quest is born within an organization. So if you're running a purpose-driven business or a not-for-profit, and it's been a while since you reviewed your business model, the first thing you want to do is get the canvas out, have a conversation with your team, run through all the elements, ask the hard questions. What are we doing here? Is this working? Should we be exploring something different? Make it work for your current context, and then start to think, okay, what's coming up on the horizon? And not just in terms of what's predictable, but what's possible on the horizon. Because if you explore the realms of possibility, you then open up the opportunity for strategic advantage, where you're the ones, there's probably more of a commercial element there. For a not-for-profit, anything that addresses emerging needs is a good thing. If you can have empathy for emerging future needs and a curiosity to explore it, you're more likely to remain viable and relevant in the market than if you just keep doing what you're doing, no matter how efficient you are.
I'm interested in the decision-making process involved in going on a quest. How do you know when the process has worked and it's provided potentially a better solution for something, or what kind of decision-making process would you suggest is involved in that?
the first thing you'd be doing when leading a quest is you'll want to cultivate a quiver of options. Quiver is this really interesting, I'm out of my depth here, but it's a surfing term. You have a quiver of arrows, but surfers have a quiver of boards. Once you have more than 2 boards, so say if you've got 3 surfboards, you have what is called a quiver, which means you can choose the appropriate board for whatever the conditions are. So if they're big waves, or if they're choppy waves, or if they're relatively flat, you can go out into the water with the right board. It's the same thing within business. So one of the early signs that a quest is working for you is that you'll start to cultivate a quiver of options. You'll have multiple possibly viable alternative options available to explore. What really works, though, is when you start to execute and implement something that no one else has done before, where you're actually literally pioneering. You're not just following the trends, you're doing something that hasn't been done before, and it's working. And that only comes about if you've explored all options, if you've conducted experiments, which you've progressively scaled. So you've made a lot of mistakes, you've learned from those mistakes, you've scaled up the experiment, and you become known as one of the first or one of the best early adopters, or one of the pioneers in this space of this new way of working. And so in the not-for-profit space, who knows, that could be how you recruit volunteers. It might be the capacity to organize and coordinate volunteers from all over the world in a synchronistic way that allows you to achieve something really epic. It might be a different approach you might think of, look, we've got this particular thing that we really want to do. Everyone else would tackle it this way. Let's explore alternative options. And at the end of a quest, quests never really end, you're always exploring, but what you'll see is implementation of something that no one else is doing.
In terms of who is leading the quest and who is driving quests within your organization, do you think that's a different style of leadership that person is taking on? How would you categorize, or I guess more describe that type of leadership, and what skills or attributes are required for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in a large multinational organization or a large national organization, usually if it's a leader with a very senior role, sometimes they're directly doing it. Sometimes their job is essentially to protect the intrapreneurs within an organization. Intrapreneurs are folks that are less motivated about climbing the ladder and building their resume and all those things, and more motivated about leveraging an organization to make a difference. They're excited about the capacity to create new value. And so if you're a senior leader and you have people on your team, so this is really apt for anyone in the not-for-profit space, particularly not-for-profits that have been around for a while, you might have a really, really savvy girl or guy who's really, really good with coding or really good at something that really wants to get in there and makes a difference. Rather than have them shackled to default work, your job can be to protect them from unnecessary admin burden and to give them space to be able to explore. So in many of the scenarios, if it's not driven by senior leaders or CEOs, these quests are driven by intrapreneurs. Now, these are folks that have their normal work to do, but they'll carve out time to progress elements of the quest. And it is a different type of leadership to your standard leadership. With a quest, you can't set a smart, clear goal. You can't set a specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-based goal. You can't some sort of target out there because you don't know exactly what the answer is. That would be very premature to do so, and it would shackle you to one specific conjured outcome, which robs you of your ability to explore and innovate and adapt along the way. So already you flipped one of the main paradigms of leadership on its head. The other thing we need to do, any quest that is led, we need to be incredibly aware of our cognitive biases. And this is where quests can die because we make these premature assumptions about what will or will not work. You'll have potentially crazy ideas shut down because of rational thinking, where people will say things like that's just not practical, and yet just on the edge of that idea is potentially the whole new pathway that could lead to incredible new relevance and value. And so anyone leading a quest needs to be very reflective and self-aware, very open to exploring, and able to maintain this objective curiosity. It's important to be able to decouple our sense of self from the work that we're doing if we're leading a quest, so that we don't find ourselves becoming overly identified or attached with one particular idea, but instead more with the process of exploring, of finding new and better ways of working. The definition of a pioneer is essentially someone who can participate in the development of a new initiative and to open up new ways. So it's a very exciting space, but it's also very different. It's not immediately gratifying. You need to create ways of creating visibility of meaningful progress with your team. So whereas a sales team, for example, can get together and review the numbers, a team leading a quest, they're going to get together and they're going to be less in a quantitative state and more in a qualitative state. They're going to be reflecting on what they've learned so far, and reflecting on what's been working, what didn't work, and what we learned, and almost projecting a sense of what's next. What are we going to lean into? What are the next experiments we're going to explore? And that's how our quest has progressed.
Now, your book, How to Lead a Quest, has a fantastic metaphor in it of the inevitable Kraken of Doom, which
Yes.
I quite enjoyed. And so I was thinking about new startup organizations who are just putting their systems in place and just working out how their organization is going to run. And I was wondering if you had any advice on what you could do to avoid the inevitable Kraken of Doom and really be more focused on different tactics, like the quests, like other kind of motivation strategies for your organization.
Yeah. It's that metaphor came to me. I just think Krakens are really cool. And if anyone's when you get the particularly the physical book, it's my wife, Kim, who runs under the name of Dangerlam. She's illustrated it throughout, so it's been really fun to draw pictures of krakens destroying ships and whatnot. The idea that a kraken is a mythical beast that dwells underwater, and you kind of don't see it until it's too late, and it's just crept up on you. And usually it's because we're being too slow, or we're not actually doing anything different. We're not changing. We're not evolving. And so for me, that served as a metaphor of business decline. No one seeks to become irrelevant, and yet we find ourselves there when we become too busy for progress or too busy for meaningful progress. And so the best strategy that we can have to avoid the inevitable Kraken of Doom, if it was just one simple thing, is carving out time to reflect on what's working and to review the business model and to essentially ask the questions, is this meeting customer needs, not just now, but the emerging customer needs of the future? And if we can ask those questions, and if we can anticipate with curiosity and empathy for the different customer segments that we have, or the different needs that we have, or the resources that we use, the people that we work with, if we ask the questions of the platforms that we use to do our business and all those things, that's how we're going to actually stay relevant. Every question literally begins with a quest. It's the first 5 letters of the word question. And it's through keeping on asking good questions that we stay relevant. It's the arrogance and the delusion of certainty that leads to the inevitable Kraken of Doom and decline into irrelevance. It's when we think we have all the answers that we're usually the furthest from the truth.
So I think another struggle for leaders, potentially more so in an established organisation, can be bringing your whole organisation with you on a particular change in strategy or change in culture for the organisation. And I was wondering how you thought that fits into the idea of going on a quest, and whether there might sometimes be a struggle when a particular solution potentially comes out of the quest, but might not be popular within the organization, and how we kind of make sure that we transition the thinking in the quest process to actually bring about whatever desired outcome we might want within the organization.
Yeah, well, the important thing about this quest piece is not the old waterfall approach where you have a say in a classic corporate sense, it might be you have a segment of people go off on some retreat and then come back and then dictate this is how things are going to be and then ambush people with change. It's more of an ongoing, enduring process in which there is constant experimentation, and the experiments that aren't working, they're back into the mix. They're reconsidered, different approaches or different methodologies are used, or the initial hypothesis is challenged, and there's better thinking that comes from that. And the experiments that are working are progressively scaled up. Now, what this means in terms of culture change, it's much more of a bimodal approach. Bimodal is where you'll have most of the people doing the default thing, and then you'll have a small team in which different rules are at play. And they may be exploring or experimenting with a new way of working or a new way of doing things. And if that continues to work, that experiment might be scaled up a little bit and more people might start to work like that. And what will usually happen, particularly if companies are looking at the trends of how leadership works, if they're shifting towards more transparent forms of leadership or flatter hierarchies, or if they're embracing more responsive organization approaches or more agility, or different internal communications platforms, all these things, they don't start with everyone jumping on board all at once. It starts with a team where they're experimenting, exploring, it works for them. The rest of the organization sees that it works for them. That grows, and before you know it, you're in this shifting thing where different teams are working on different things at different times, and the experiments that are working are progressed and scaled up, and the experiments that aren't are reconsidered. And so culture change becomes a constant evolving thing rather than something that's initiated once every few years, every time that an organization needs to do restructuring.
Excellent. So it's a smoother change that is less likely to startle people.
Probably, yeah. Maybe not smooth. It's as opposed to smooth
gradual.
jazz. It's probably like improvisational jazz. Like there are sometimes, sometimes you're going to drop the beat. Sometimes things aren't going to work. But with enough units, jazz is probably a good metaphor here. If you have a jazz band, and everyone's like working on their own instruments and their own piece, and then someone has a go at something and it doesn't really quite work. You have the team around you to pick up the beat and the rhythm, and it all kind of progresses on nicely. And so it's not a smooth ride necessarily. It's bumpy, but here's another thing for your listeners to check out. Check out responsive.org. I think responsive.org. There's a movement starting, and I see this a lot with clients of mine that are going through growth, where they've built something, it's really, really working, and they get me on board to do some work in motivation design with culture. And what I see is that they're so busy, they're doing so much work that they're just looking towards the old corporate model, and they're saying we need to create new role descriptions and clear KPIs for people, and essentially just going to replicate the big model that corporates are currently trapped in, that they can't stand and it's not working. And rather than adopt that model, check out responsive.org. It's the last reorganization you'll ever need. And this is much more about increasing the autonomy of how you work together across multiple teams. It's how you communicate, how you connect with each other, and it's the way of the future.
Now, something that I always like to discuss with guests is the process of going from having a great idea and a lot of enthusiasm and support from mentors and advice and all that to actually bringing it to fruition in the real world. And we've had a lot of different perspectives and advice on that. And I think that might be something that you'd be able to offer some great insights on as someone who has brought a lot of different and interesting ideas into fruition.
Yeah, nice. Well, I'm really lucky. A good mate of mine, Matt Church, is the founder of Thought Leaders Global, and going through Thought Leaders Business School on the curriculum which I now mentor and teach in. has really taught me around how to capture, package, and deliver world-class intellectual property. And it's very, very easy. And as someone, who did a PhD and, had to be a recovering academic, it's really easy to spend a lot of time admiring the complexity of a problem, admiring ideas, and not really actually progressing with them at all. So my process, which essentially in my business, it's the thought leadership is the main product that I sell. It's the distillation of thinking in order to be delivered as advice to help people to make meaningful progress. So my process is really, and this thought leadership piece is relevant for any business. It's to be mindful of not just simply being a thought follower. This is something that my church taught me very early on. It's something that all academics do quite well, and many of us will do in business anyway. When you're reading things and when you're hearing things, it's really easy just to read it passively. But a really cool tip is to read with a couple of highlighters, so a yellow and a pink highlighter. And when you're reading something, you can read through and highlight anything you think where your response is, yeah, but. And this is where you'll read something and you'll think, yeah, but that's only going to work in the American context. It won't really work here. And yeah, but that's fine if you've got a team where everyone's situated in the one room, but how would that work if most of your team is remote? Or yeah, but blah, blah, blah. And then the other highlighter is for the yes and. When you read something and you think, that's really good, or you listen to like one of the podcasts that you've got on Sproutcast here, and you're listening and you're taking notes on the yes and, yeah, that's kind of like this, and if we combine this with this, we'll get this. And so the result is with the yes and the yeah buts is you're actively participating in the consumption of information. So rather than just passively consuming information, you're working with it, and you're starting to grow perspective, your own perspective on how things could be. And through collecting yes ands and yeah buts, you start to develop thought leadership. Now, there's more complexity to this. In my world, we need to think about, whether ideas are contextual, conceptual, or much more concrete in content, whether, get the balance between logical frames and emotive frames, weave in metaphors, models, stories, and studies, and all those things in order to effectively package and communicate an idea. But if that's not the main product that you're selling, still asking these questions, particularly with curiosity and empathy for emerging needs in the market, will lead you to do more things. Then comes the experimentation. And this is where books like Lean Startup can be really, really effective. I find that sometimes there's almost this evangelical zeal that some people have around lean startup and conducting minimum viable experiments, minimum viable products that have such little thinking involved with it that they will never really work. I think that lean startup approach, so rapid experimentation combined with really good slow thinking, is a really good way to actually progress ideas beyond conceptual notions into something that's going to make a difference.
Wonderful. So hopefully that's a good starting point for a lot of our listeners who are kind of thinking on their ideas and not really knowing how to jump in and where to get started. So before we finish up, Jason, where are some places that people can get in contact with you if they want to chat about what you do or ask any further questions about anything you've said today?
Yeah, cool. I'm really hard to pin down, but the best thing to do. I'm personally pretty terrible at social media, so I do it with no strategy whatsoever. I have a wonderful team that helps with that. But the best thing that I do, and the thing that I love is I write a newsletter, MUSE. I think that's really clever, newsletter, around roughly once a month. And you can join my Making Clever Happen newsletter at my website, which is drjasonfox.com/PEW. That's the sound a laser makes when you shoot it. Pew! So drjasonfox.com/PEW is where you can sign up to my newsletter. It's completely free. Just pop in your email address and About once a month I'm in that. I'm sharing not only what's happening in my world and what I'm seeing, usually sharing a new article, and also cool things that I've seen and read on the internet, or read in terms of books. And so the result is I'm sharing, here's some really good stuff. And so if you're on the quest to embrace more pioneering leadership in your work, and you want to have new, and if you want to keep learning and have new things to explore, then I'd love for you to join up on the newsletter.
Wonderful. Yeah, I can definitely vouch for that. I've been a subscriber for some time, and there's always very funny and interesting and surprising things that you've got in your newsletter, so I do enjoy that. Yeah. And of course, your book, How to Lead a Quest, is coming out, I think, is it early February?
Yeah, early February. It should be on shelves, and all good booksellers and whatnot. It's also available from our website, so you can grab it wherever you want. It's really cool. I love it. I've got it in my hand here. The illustrations in here. The text is good too, but the illustrations are so good. It's a really nifty book. How to Lead a Quest, a handbook for pioneering executives.
Wonderful. And we didn't actually discuss it specifically today, but some of the ideas that we covered off were kind of inspired by your previous book, which is called The Game Changer, if anyone's looking for that. So wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Jason. It's been really excellent.
Yeah, great. No, thank you.
The newsletter includes copies of the show notes and additional content from each episode.